Hello and welcome to my video where I'm going to show you how to knit this vertical wave pattern. As you can see, the pattern is very textured and I think it looks like large garter stitch ridges, except vertical rather than horizontal. It's a 4-row pattern repeat, but there are a couple of tricky bits in here, so hopefully you're up for a challenge. Okay, so the first thing you need to do is cast on an odd number of stitches. I personally cast on 11. I used a long tail cast on, but you can use any method. The first row is a preparation row, which means it's not going to be repeated in the pattern. All you need to do is repeat knit 1, purl 1 across the row. So you knit a stitch, then bring the working yarn between the needles to the front and purl a stitch. Take the working yarn between the needles to the back again and knit a stitch, then purl a stitch, then knit a stitch, and so on. Always remember that the working yarn needs to be at the back behind the needles for a knit stitch and at the front towards you for a purl stitch. And then you'll finish this row on a knit stitch. We then move on to row 1 of the pattern repeat, which represents the wrong side or the back of the knitting. You need to begin by purling 1 stitch. Then take the working yarn between the needles to the back and knit a stitch. And then bring the working yarn to the front again and purl a stitch. This time though, you need to wrap the yarn twice around the right hand needle tip, like so. This just creates an extra wrap of yarn on your needle. You then just repeat knit 1 and purl 1 with 2 wraps around the needle over and over until you've only got 2 stitches left. So that's knit 1 and purl 1 with 2 yarn wraps. A knit stitch, a purl stitch with 2 wraps, and so on. And for the last 2 stitches, you just knit a stitch and then do a regular purl stitch. Next, for row 2, you begin by knitting a stitch, then you purl a stitch and take the working yarn between the needles to the back. In order to do the next stitch, you first need to take a closer look at your knitting. So trace downwards from the top stitch on your left hand needle and you should see a line of V-shaped stitches. To the right of these stitches should be a few horizontal strands of yarn. You now need to take your right hand needle from front to back underneath the second strand down, like so. You then need to slip a stitch purlwise, keeping the working yarn at the back. So take your right hand needle down to the next stitch as if to purl, but instead of purling it, you just slip it off the end of the needle. You'll notice that you not only slip the top stitch, but also the wrapped yarn that was underneath. You'll then need to use your left hand needle to pick up the 2 crossed strands of yarn underneath the stitch you just slipped. Then take them over the slip stitch and drop them off the end of the needle. And then you repeat that until you've only got 2 stitches left. So that's purl 1, then take the working yarn between the needles to the back, find those strands of yarn to the right of that line of V-shaped stitches, take your right hand needle from front to back under that second strand, slip a stitch purlwise, keeping the working yarn at the back. Then use your left hand needle to pick up those 2 cross strands. Take them over the slip stitch and drop them off the end of the needle. And just repeat this until you've only got 2 stitches left. And then for the last 2 stitches, you just purl a stitch and then knit a stitch. Row 3 is the same as row 1, so I'll just put the pattern for that up on screen now. Remember that for every purl stitch, except for the first one and the last one, you wrap the yarn twice around the right hand needle tip. Row 4 is similar to row 2 and we begin in the same way. So that's knit 1, then purl 1, then take the working yarn to the back. You then need to find that same line of stitches as before, tracing down from the top stitch on the left hand needle. This time though, you're looking at the left hand side of these stitches to find the horizontal strands. You then take your right hand needle from front to back underneath the second strand down. Then slip a stitch purlwise, making sure the working yarn stays at the back. If you look down on your knitting, you should see a gap on the left hand side of your right hand needle. You need to use your right hand needle to bring the slip stitch down through this gap to the front. And then just repeat this over and over. So that's purl 1, take the working yarn between the needles to the back, find the horizontal strands of yarn to the left of that line of stitches, take your right hand needle from front to back under the second strand down, slip a stitch purlwise with the yarn in back, then use your right hand needle to bring the slip stitch down through that gap to the front of the knitting. And just repeat this until you've only got 2 stitches left. For the last 2 stitches, you just need to purl a stitch and then knit a stitch. And that's it, that's the 4-row pattern repeat completed. I then just repeated this twice more, and this was the result. As you can see, there are vertical wave shapes on the front, and I think it creates a nice 3D effect. On the back, it looks more like ribbing, so this pattern is not reversible. And that's it, that's how you make the vertical wave pattern. I really hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.